Wish We Could Turn Back Time by Girlinpink44. Chapter 20. End of the Beginning. Occasionally, Tony put his own foot in his mouth, and it bit him on the butt. Perhaps the press conference was one of those times. In an effort to get the spotlight off of the boys, he had thrown it on himself in a rather unorganized fashion. Honestly, he didn't regret it. The heat was on him, but less so than the last time around. At least for now. He hadn't been out in public a whole lot since that press conference. Shaking away his thoughts, he opened his eyes, grinning at the two boys who were sleeping on either side of him. Peter was curled up into his side, a hand over the arc reactor. Harley was on the other, his hand atop Peter's. The two boys hadn't wanted to be far from him for too long. He had been working on Stark Industries R&D from his lab here. Both boys were finishing their schoolwork remotely. The idea of how they'd approach the upcoming school year was a problem he didn't want to tackle. His right hand wandered into Peter's curls. The boy let out a soft sigh and nestled closer to Tony's side. Journey grinned at the soft, gentle action. For this moment, a lot of his world was right here. It truly was the perfect way to start his birthday. The door to the bedroom opened and Pepper stepped in. "Happy birthday." Tony smiled. "Thanks." It was hard to believe it was his birthday. Instead of being over 50, he was back in his late 30s. Last time around, he'd spent this birthday in isolation besides his trip to the gala, held in his honor but using his mother's name. Harley and Peter weren't in his life, and he had no idea what was ahead of him. "I have a present for you." She held up a photo. Tony realized it was a sonogram, and sure enough, he could make out the small shape of Morgan. His baby girl. The missing piece of his family. "Everything okay?" Pepper nodded. "Hopefully in a few weeks, I'm past the worst of this morning sickness. But everything looks good. She's developing as she should be, though of course it's too early to say if it's a girl." "But you're confident?" Pepper sat on the bed, laying on the far side of Harley and putting her head on his shoulder. "In this timeline, I hadn't been with anyone in a bit. Also, the timeline adds up. I'm about 9 weeks along, and that's how long we've been back." Harley shuffled, stretching slightly before opening his eyes. "Morning, mechanic. Morning, Pepper." "Morning, Patatino." Harley paused. "Happy birthday." Harley placed a kiss on the boy's head. "Thank you." Peter stared. "Sleeping, Harley? Quiet." Tony chuckled. "Good morning, Rue." He ran his hands through the boy's curls and Peter leaned into the touch. "Happy birthday, Dad." Tony would never grow tired of hearing those words from his son's mouth. "Thank you, Bambino." His boys. He put an arm around both and grinned. A year ago, they'd both been gone. Morgan had made him a card. He'd put it on his desk at the lake house. 5 years ago, Peter had been over and surprised him with a digital photo book of photos he and Friday had taken. It was a present he had clung to, especially in the early days after the snap. The ones where he didn't know how he was going to get from day one to the next. A photo sat on his lap, his boys on either side of him. By his next birthday, he'd have all 3 kids. He couldn't wait to see Harley and Peter act as big brothers. "There's breakfast downstairs." While the boys were younger than they had been a mere months, or years from Tony's perspective, ago, food called to them like it always did, and both scrambled off of the bed and took off for the kitchen. Shaking his head affectionately, Tony got up and put his arm around Pepper, and the pair made their way downstairs. It was so domestic, and Tony loved it. Waking up on his birthday, eating breakfast with the woman he loved, and the sons that were his in all but blood. It was something he'd never thought he'd have again. A breakfast spread sat out on the counter, and the boys were clamouring to fill their plates. At the table, Rhodey and Happy already sat. Both got up and came over to greet Tony. "Happy birthday, boss." "Happy birthday, Tones." "Thanks, guys." He grabbed a cup and filled it with coffee, taking a long sip. "Feels surreal. Celebrating here in Malibu. We haven't done that in over 10 years. Maybe this time you can not tell your address to terrorists?" Harley looked up from where he had put some food on the table. "Just a suggestion." Tony grinned at the boy, who was finally gaining back enough confidence to be a little shit again. For weeks he'd been a shell of himself, as nightmares plagued him. In fact, that's why he'd been in Tony's bed. And wherever Harley went, Peter went. "May and Ben will be here later. Rose sends her regards, but with Abby's final week of preschool being this week, she wants to try and keep up her routine going." Tony nodded. "We're going to be disrupting it enough, especially if they potentially move to New York this summer." That was one of the many, many things the coming months brought him. Tony wondered if the next few days were the last quiet before another storm, which would be followed by another and another, and lead all the way to Thanos. But he could see a large chunk of his family with him. The Stones had given him a gift by giving him this support system. All of the people closest to him, and some of the ones closest to them, were there. "Charles and the others are coming tomorrow night, right?" Tony looked up to see Pepper on her tablet. Currently, it was one of a kind, made just for her. Like him, she had grown frustrated with the state of technology. It was something he'd have to be careful about fixing. The world needed to be more advanced than it had been at the point of the snap, but he needed to make sure he didn't push too far too fast. The first round of tablets, phones and computers was set to release next year, which was a couple of years ahead of where he had been before. He'd probably skip a few versions in the notes he sent to the scientists. As long as they kept up, he could launch ahead. Yes, so are the Pims. Hank mentioned he's excited to finally meet Peter and wonders if he could come by the house earlier in the day. Peter looked up. "Why does he want to meet me?" "He's an entomologist. I thought he could help us take a closer look at your powers than the two of us did. I want to get Bruce in on it as well, as he's one of the leading experts in genetic mutation, even this far back in the past." That perked up the spiderling. "You mean Dr. Pym could help us find more out about what the bite did to my body?" Tony nodded. "You were still developing too, so there's a chance this time you'll be even stronger." "That's insane!" Harley chimed in, waving a forkful of pancakes for dramatic effect. Somehow he managed not to get syrup all over it, which Tony appreciated. "There was that video of you catching that bus, and that was before you had mechanic suit." Tony grinned, aware that mechanic was basically Harley speak for Dad. "Who knows? It's something we can explore. Now, it's my birthday, so what are we doing today?" Both boys chimed in with suggestions, and Tony looked between them and to Happy and Rhodey, who were also chiming in. Pepper settled into the seat next to him, and Tony revelled in the domestic bliss. It was something he'd never take for granted. Hindsight truly was 20/20, and he would appreciate the knowledge even if carrying it could be a burden. Around him, the world may be crazy, but with all of his family around him, he felt better about the situation than he had in far too long. Seeing Peter and Harley in matching junior-sized tuxedos was adorable. Both of them alternated between being disgruntled with the dressy attire and hamming it up at the attention the press and patrons alike were giving them. It was the first time he'd been out in public with the boys since they'd been kidnapped, and their mini sunglasses were the only thing keeping them from going blind altogether. Cameras were flashing as they made their way into the concert hall where the people had gathered. In the past, he'd hated events like this. To be honest, he still hated events like this. But there was something about having people he knew around. Ben and May were mingling with some of the Maria Stark Foundation guests. Tony was trying to talk at least one of them into taking a position there. He believed May could do a lot of good, and if Ben wanted a job, Tony would find one for him. Happy could always use another member on his team, and if it was someone who knew, or rather was aware of, the skeletons they kept hidden in the closet, it would be a good fit. Stubborn Parkers. He'd win eventually. He had been wearing May down as it was before the snap, so he had a head start. He encouraged people to bring their kids to the event. After all, it was his birthday party, and he wanted to bring his own 2 sons. To further the effort, there was a kids area set up in one of the side rooms. He had rented inflatable bounce houses, hired some entertainers, and made it kid-friendly. Even so, the boys were close by his side as he began making the rounds. He greeted people, some of which he hadn't seen in years in the previous timeline. He'd let events like this fall to the wayside in the aftermath of the Civil War. Perhaps he'd make sure to keep up a better balance between Tony Stark and Iron Man. Speaking of, Rhodey was leading around some of the committee members beyond the debrief of the rescue mission in months, and he needed to look into missions and to take care of the 10 rings this time around. "Charles!" Tony called over to the man who sat talking with people. He recognized some science journals and others as members of the state legislature. Eventually, Tony needed to make sure that he helped mutants get the support they needed. He had seen how much power his name carried, and this time around, he had used that power more wisely. "Tony! And Peter and Harley too. It is nice to see you both in better circumstances." "You're Professor Xavier! We talked that day on the playground," Peter waved. "That we did. I read some of your articles on the X-Gene and had some questions." Charles grinned, and Tony knew there was a fond one on his face as well. Thankfully, with Charles in on the time travel secret, Peter didn't have to hide his age or attempt to downplay or mask his intelligence. "I'd love to talk it over with you. Perhaps when you come back to New York, your dad can bring you to my school and we can talk. Harley, I hear you are quite the engineer. I've got some people who would be interested in talking to you as well." Both boys' faces lit up, and Tony put a hand on their shoulders. "It sounds like a plan." Taking Peter, especially, to Xavier's school was high on his list. It was one of the few places on the planet where Peter could completely cut loose and not have to worry about controlling his powers. Powers that might change or develop considerably, since Peter is on a different side of puberty than he was during the initial bite. He wondered if it was worth trying to get in touch with Banner before they would naturally meet up, or let things play out in a similar way as to how they did in the years that never were. "Thank you for the invite, Dr. Stark." Tony looked over to see the Ancient One walk up, looking surprisingly in place, yet out of place, in a formal gown like the other guests. "I'm honored you'd come. I'd like to introduce you to someone." He led her over to where Charles was talking with the boys. "Charles, I'd like to introduce you to the Ancient One, the current Sorcerer Supreme of Earth." Charles offered his hand and she shook it. "Dr. Charles Xavier, the world's leading scholar on mutants. I have read some of your papers and find them to be fascinating." She turned. "And you are his sons, the ones for whom your father was willing to break and change the laws of time for." Both boys looked away bashfully, and while Tony wanted to dispute her rather blunt statement, he knew that he couldn't. He had done exactly that, but in his defense, one of those times, he hadn't done so intentionally. "Peter, Harley, this is the Sorcerer Supreme." Both shook her hand, eyes wide. "Professor, I'd love to set up a time to talk more. As allies of Dr. Stark's in the days to come, I think it's essential we coordinate more." "Of course." Tony nodded as the pair continued to talk, but he led the boys away. He saw Pepper across the room, her gown the same colour as it had been in the previous timeline, but a different cut reflecting her slightly changed style. She looked beautiful. They walked by Happy. "Keep an eye on these two for a second, will you?" Happy looked over to where Pepper was standing and nodded with a grin on his face. Got it. Both boys wore similar grins on their faces. As Tony walked away, he realised he would have 6 extra eyes on him and Peppa than they had had at this point in time. At least they figured out a lot to get to this point. Peppa was talking to some guests and Tony walked up. "May I steal Miss Potts for a dance?" The guests nodded and he held out his hand and she took it, leading her to the dance floor. The pair slowly danced alongside the other couples on the dance floor. "That colour looks fantastic on you." "I'm aware you're partial to it, considering a certain suit," she grinned. "Remember the last time we did this?" "It feels like a lifetime ago." And in some ways, it really had been. The world wasn't aware of Iron Man and his role. To them, he was a wayward playboy who was recovering from a traumatic incident. Obadiah was in power still, and Pepper was no more than his assistant. "It does." He spun her around, gently knowing that she was carrying precious cargo. Someday, all too soon, they'd have to break that news, and it would cause a nightmare with the press. At least, when Morgan had been born in the other timeline, they were together properly. Technically they were now, but the world didn't know. "I can't help but think of how far we've come," he grinned. "Even if it's hard to see, considering the circumstances. But how much we'll be able to do with what we know." "You've never been one to accept limits, Tony." He grinned. "Why should I?" She returned his grin. "It's one of my favourite things about you. It's also one of the things that exasperates me the most." That got him to chuckle. "It keeps you on your toes." "Speaking of, I realised something on my way over to steal you away." "What's that?" He nodded over his shoulder to where he knew Peter and Harley were watching. "We've got plenty of extra eyes watching our every move." "I'm aware they're not your sons by blood, but they act too much like you for that not to worry me. I'm afraid that on our first fight, they'd parent trap us or something." Both laughed at the idea that was perhaps a bit too plausible. "I'm glad you're here with me, Pep. I couldn't do this again without you." She smiled at him, leaning closer. "As long as I'm able, I'll be by your side, supporting you through this." They kissed. It was sweet and slow. Tony was sure someone would catch a shot, and it would end up on the cover of tabloids all over the world, and trend on barely existing social media sites. But he didn't care. There was so much that the world could never know. He hoped they'd never know some of the things he hadn't been able to protect them from last time around. This time, he'd do it. People often wish they had the chance to turn back time. But this time, he really could. And he was going to make the most of it. Director Nicholas Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D. eyed the footage that had been taken over the course of the last 2 months, and compared it to years of footage he had stored. While he had never actively recruited the son of Howard Stark, he had kept tabs on the son of one of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s founders. Things didn't add up since Stark's return from Afghanistan, and now he wondered what he was missing that would cause such a change. The door to his office opened, and one of his most loyal and dependable agents walked in. "You asked to see me?" "I have a new assignment for you." He held out a folder, and she took it, reading it over. "Stark?" "Something's changed, and I want to know if that change should be something I'm concerned about." The redhead looked up at him. "You want me to infiltrate Stark Industries and try to get close to him? Security has been beefed up since he got back." "Which is why I'm sending you." He handed her a second folder. "I want you to build a profile on him. Perhaps he should be considered for the Avengers Initiative." End of chapter, end of story. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that. I love that. Peter and Harley being cute on his birthday and going to the gala with him in mini tuxes and meeting Charles and the Ancient One being in a dress. Oh my god, I love that so much. There is a sequel to this. And I will be doing it, don't worry. I've got some other Avengers things lined up, and I think you guys are going to really enjoy that. So anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.